It's a privilege to welcome Katie Williams, who is going to be speaking this evening. Um, Katie has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Colorado School of Mines, and then made that logical jump to anthropology and earning a master's and a PhD from the University of New Mexico. She's currently a postdoctoral scholar at Crow Canyon, working on spatial analysis, geospatial analyses, and she will be speaking tonight on part of data from her dissertation, looking at architectural data as a means of studying labor organization and degrees and kinds of cooperation structure of labor groups and work groups in that in the past at Betatakin and Keet Seel. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie and again, thank you all for joining us this evening. So Katie, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Let me get my screen shared here. All right. Um, Hato Chakiwietha, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining this evening and for welcoming me into this space to talk a little bit about some of my work. As Eric mentioned, I graduated from the University of New Mexico, actually back in May, so it's fairly recent. And the work I'm going to talk about today is part of my dissertation work, it's more than I could fit into a 45-minute talk, but I hope that this is kind of a good overview of that work and kind of the results of that work. So before I get started here, let me make sure there we go. I did want to let everyone know that throughout this presentation, I am going to be showing images that show or include parts of the interiors of architectural spaces at Betatakin and Keet Seel. I tried to avoid kivas as much as possible, but on some of the kind of larger site overview images, you might be able to see some of those spaces. I also do have one or two slides that show close-up images of multi-layered plasters that are on the interiors of kivas. And I know many people may not feel necessarily comfortable with seeing that kind of sensitive space. So I wanted to let everyone know in advance that there is a possibility you might be seeing some kivas through this presentation. So this presentation is structured kind of following my dissertation defense. So this is a rough outline of what I'm going to talk through. And I practiced several times, but I kept getting a little bit off course when I get to talking about the results, because that is when I show kind of most of the images of the architecture, and it's really easy to get kind of caught up in the details. So I have a timer going on the side here. I'm going to try really hard to stick to the time. But I'm going to begin by talking about the research objective, or really why I decided to do this work and why I think it's important. Then I'm going to provide some of the theoretical framework or context for how we go from looking at the architecture that is still present in these spaces to trying to begin to think about the labor organization associated with the construction of that architecture. I'll very, very briefly go over a little bit of the background information about Betatakin and Keet Seel, and then I'll talk through the methods and models that I used and evaluated, and kind of wrap it up talking about the results and conclusions and so on. So my entire dissertation was focused on architecture and labor organization. And really what I mean by that is that I'm interested in how people organized when they were building their homes. And so there are a couple of parts to this question. The first is this idea of home. And when we're looking at ancestral places on the landscape, we are really relying oftentimes on architecture itself to help kind of demarcate homes or households, because we oftentimes can't talk to people directly to find out where they considered to be part of their home spaces. At Betatakin and Keet Seel, and I will talk about this more further on in the presentation, I'm very, very fortunate that Dr. Jeffrey Dean did his dissertation work in this area, And a lot of his analyses actually included Betatakin and Keet Seel and focused specifically on conducting some architectural analyses and identifying not only different room types or functions on the basis of various architectural attributes that he saw present in these spaces, but also identifying social groups that were kind of associated with these different spaces. So on this screen, I have an example of what is called a room cluster, or essentially a room suite. This would be kind of the architectural footprint of a house. On the left side of the screen, I have an image based, or kind of clipped from a map that was based on Dr. Dean's overall site plan for Betatakin. And on the right, I have a photograph of that same space taken in 2021 with the same spaces kind of labeled. Dr. Dean identified different room types such as granaries and living rooms, as well as mealing rooms and kivas, kind of on the basis of architectural features like the presence of hearths or other features like wall entries or doorways that could be sealed to prevent pest entry. But he also identified that certain types of rooms or groups of rooms were spatially associated, meaning that within these sort of room clusters, these rooms are centered on a central courtyard area. And overall, these room footprints can be taken to be sort of the basic architectural household. This is the sort of fundamental social unit at these particular communities. The other part of this question has to do with how people organized when it came to building their homes. And there are two parts to this. So the first is that at Betatakin and Keet Seel, again, based on Dr. Dean's work, it has been demonstrated that these room clusters weren't added room by room. That is, the additive unit of construction, what was being built at any given time, was the entire suite of rooms. So entire households were being added to these communities during different construction projects. And the other part of this aspect of the question is that when people are building, and especially when they're building multiple spaces like a room cluster, they tend to work together in groups. It is not totally impossible for individuals to be involved in building, but most of the time you have groups of at least two people who are working together. Sometimes this is logistically necessary. You might need the extra strength or extra hands to lift the roof beam into place. And oftentimes it's a matter of efficiently and effectively working to complete a larger task. But in general, you have some sort of group. And so I wanted to understand if it was possible to identify what these groups might have looked like based on the architecture. So how do you do this? How do you go from buildings, what you actually see in these contexts, to the builders and how those builders were organizing themselves? Archaeologists around the world, but especially in the Southwest, have employed a concept and a theoretical framework that uses the idea of an operational chain, or basically a series of steps and choices that are involved in making anything. Oftentimes, archaeologists will apply this concept to more mobile belongings like ceramics. But in this particular case, I am viewing architecture as kind of the culmination of a series of choices that builders are making. And when people work together, they tend to share those choices. They share access to the same materials, they share access to the same technical skill and know-how, and they share access to the same goals. So overall, the series of choices that builders make in the process of building, kind of within the same labor group, result in a similar building or a similar architectural presence. But there are multiple forms of potential labor groups that might be at work in these communities. So in terms of these room clusters, which I've already kind of discussed earlier on, these are the households. These are the people who were living in and using these spaces. As I mentioned earlier, they tend to be multiple rooms kind of centered on a courtyard area. They also tend to range in size. At Keet Seel, the smallest is about 2 rooms in size, and the largest is about 12 rooms in size, and they are the additive construction unit. Based on Dr. Dean's work, at Betatakin, there are at least 18 of these room clusters or household units, and at Keet Seel, there are at least 25 of these household units. So this represents a potentially large and substantial labor pool. And it also represents a lot of building. So this is one potential labor group. Dr. Dean also identified another form or kind of layer of social organization, and specifically at Betatakin and other Kayenta communities, um, that he calls courtyard complexes. And these are essentially a form of suprahousehold organization. And this image here is from Betatakin. It shows kind of a clip of the same map with an example of two room clusters that share a courtyard in common. These might be neighbors who have a reasonable expectation that they can share a courtyard space and get along. It may be an extended family, maybe in-laws moving in next to relatives. But at Betatakin, Dr. Dean identified at least four of these courtyard complexes. And at Keet Seel, it's a lot less clear-cut, but he identified two potential such courtyard complexes. So at both communities, there are these architecturally identifiable or potentially architecturally identifiable kind of larger social units that also might represent a sort of labor group or labor pool that might be responsible for construction. And then lastly, there is always the possibility that everyone in the community helped out with any given building task, or that there was a sort of Kayenta construction crew or a specialist group of builders who were responsible for building anytime a new family moved in or needed to have additional construction done. So, I'm gonna jump into talking a little bit about some of the background context. Um, so I totally missed saying this earlier, but Betatakin and Keet Seel are located in what archaeologists call the Kayenta region. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with kind of the Southwest and specifically Arizona. The Kayenta region is kind of located up in the northeastern corner of Arizona, up near the Four Corners region, which is depicted on this map here. And I have Tsegi Canyon, which is where Betatakin and Keet Seel are both located, indicated with a red circle up in the upper left part of the map. Um, I also have superimposed on the topo map these light blue polygons that reflect or represent kind of current reservation or off-reservation trust land. And I put these specific layers in here because I wanted to emphasize that these sites, these ancestral places, are presently on Navajo Nation, and there are very long-lived and enduring connections between descendant communities and the ancestors that built these spaces. And specifically for Betatakin and Keet Seel, there are very strong connections between the ancestors and Hopi today. So even though I'm talking specifically about an ancestral time period, there are our descendants and relatives who live very nearby today. So I'm focusing mostly on what archaeologists have called the Tsegi Phase in sort of the Kayenta region. And this is a sort of terminal occupation from an archaeological perspective for Kayenta populations in this region. After about 1300 AD, people had mostly moved to other parts of the Southwest. Um, I have a map here showing Tsegi Canyon kind of just northwest of Black Mesa, and then an inset showing a little bit more specifically where Betatakin and Keet Seel are located. They are both part of Navajo National Monument, which is administered by the National Park Service. And if you ever have the opportunity to go by and visit Navajo National Monument, I do recommend it. Betatakin and Keet Seel are both incredible feats of engineering and are two of the largest alcove or cliff dwelling sites in the Southwest and are comparable in terms of scale to many of the cliff dwellings up at Mesa Verde National Park. I also, as I mentioned earlier, am very much building much of my dissertation work off of the excellent work of Dr. Jeffrey Dean. And so I have a very tattered kind of copy of publication that derived from his work, kind of pictured here. Dr. Dean's work not only involved the architectural analyses that I discussed earlier, in which he identified these kind of basic social units as well as different room types, but he also focused specifically on chronological analyses. And his work kind of represents a seminal change in the way that dendroarchaeologists or dendrochronologists kind of thought about sites and chronology building. Prior to his work, oftentimes there would be one or two dates that were taken to be representative of entire sites. But for his dissertation, Dr. Dean actually went in and looked at individual architectural contexts, and he dated specific construction events, specific roof building events or wall building events. And he not only assembled all of this absolute dating information, but he also looked at bond abutment relationships within kind of the sequence of construction to establish overall relative sequences for entire sets of rooms in these different room clusters, but then also across communities and across sites. And what this means is that for Betatakin and Keet Seel, which were included in his dissertation work, we actually have a really robust chronological building sequence for both the overall extent of construction, but then also individual construction stages or waves for each community. So I'm going to just very briefly try to cover a lot of information about Betatakin, which is also called Talastima. This information on this slide and on the next slide about Keet Seel are derived from or come directly from Dr. Dean's research. And so again, without his work, I would not have been able to do any of the work that I'm going to present on later on in this presentation. So Betatakin had about a 19-year span of construction from about 1267 to 1286. There's a possibility that some construction sort of predated that 1267 time period, but there is no architectural footprint or construction present in the alcove that predates the Tsegi Phase. So there's only about this 19-year span of construction, and this is important for thinking about architectural labor and identifying builders based on looking at the architecture, because this short time period of construction, which is maybe 1 or 2 generations worth of builders, indicates that we're probably not going to see a lot of temporally based changes in construction. People are probably not going to be making major shifts in material sources or major innovations in construction engineering or technology over this relatively short time period. Based on his dendrochronological work, Dr. Dean also identified that at Betatakin specifically, and especially in kind of the first 10 years or so of construction, room clusters were being built in the alcove in kind of these discrete waves. And this has a couple of implications, especially when you combine that with the existence of these courtyard complexes. This sort of implies that the people moving into Betatakin alcove did so in a very planned manner. They were moving in and saving space for the people they wanted to share a courtyard with. They were also moving in and choosing their building spaces based on these waves of arrivals coming into the alcove. As you can see in this image kind of overview of the alcove in the background of the slide, the central portion of the alcove has been heavily weathered, and a lot of the architecture is actually gone now. Some of that is due in part to rockfall, and some of that is due in part to the active seep spring that kind of undermines architecture. But despite that, there are about 135 architectural spaces or rooms that can be identified at Betatakin. Maybe 90 or so, 95 or so of those spaces are still extant with some form of standing architecture. And overall, despite the high number of rooms, there's a general degree of architectural homogeneity at Betatakin. And this is kind of illustrated by the 2 images in the bottom left part of the screen. These are both front walls of living rooms. They are made out of hakal or wattle and daub construction. And generally, there is nothing about the architecture at Betatakin that strikes you as immediately visually or visibly distinct from any other space. It seems like overall the people building at Betatakin did so in this kind of planned fashion, and they did so making very similar choices. If you add to this that there is evidence of stockpiling of building materials, when the first wave of builders arrived in the alcove, they actually stockpiled primary beams for later arrivals to use in their construction. And you kind of take this whole picture overall, Dr. Dean actually suggests or conjectures that perhaps the people moving into Betatakin alcove knew each other prior to moving into this space. They may even have come from the same kind of origin village elsewhere in the area and decided to move in a very orderly and planned fashion into the alcove. Keet Seel or Kawestima is a very interesting contrast to the situation at Betatakin. It has a longer construction period or construction phase during the Tsegi period. It's about 36 years of active construction, as reflected by the dendrochronological dates. Also, unlike Betatakin at Keet Seel, there is architecture present or remnants of architecture in the talus slope below the alcove, or architecture that has been incorporated into later construction that may date back as far as the Pueblo I period. There is also no evidence of stockpiling, with the possible exception of the very large retaining wall that kind of spans a large portion of the front of the community of Keet Seel. You can kind of see it in the alcove at the center of the image. Generally, every household was seemingly having to gather their own building materials. There's a much higher degree of architectural variability, and households are moving into the alcove. And again, this is all based on Dr. Dean's dendrochronological work. They're doing this in a kind of ad hoc manner. They're moving in and out of the alcove kind of as needed on the basis of individual household or room clusters. They are also frequently reusing existing architectural spaces or modifying them and remodeling them to suit their needs. And so overall, a lot more variability. And unlike Betatakin, where again there is a significant amount of loss of architecture in the central portion of the alcove, but Dr. Dean records only one kiva being present. At Keet Seel, there are multiple kivas present. So overall, this could suggest that the people moving into Keet Seel alcove needed some more social integration or something to kind of tie them together in a way that the people moving into Betatakin alcove did not necessarily need. There's also no evidence of courtyard complexes, which suggests that even if there were some sort of supra-household groups present at Keet Seel, they didn't have the luxury of space or saving space for their next of kin or their friends to come and build next to them. So as at Betatakin, Dr. Dean suggests that this sort of construction sequence and settlement pattern might indicate that we can say some things about the people moving into the alcove. And in this case, it might suggest that the people moving into Keet Seel came from a variety of different origin villages, and they may not have necessarily known each other or had very strong ties prior to moving into the alcove, though they evidently knew each other well enough to go and move into the same space. Okay, so thinking about the methods, how we actually go from the architecture that we see in the alcoves to the understanding or trying to understand the labor groups that were responsible for construction. How do we do this? Well, we have to start by looking at architectural attributes and kind of backtracking from the architecture that is physically present and sort of the manifestation of all of these choices that builders are making through backwards to the construction stages or all of the steps that are involved in building. And from there, try to identify commonalities or variability that might reflect membership in sort of different labor groups and see if those labor groups map onto any sort of social units. So on this slide, I have actually two examples of living room walls. The Hakal wall or wattle and daub wall is a living room at Betatakin. The masonry wall is a living room at Keet Seel. So you can see that some architectural attributes are very visibly apparent. You can identify them kind of quickly and at a glance. This is not an uncommon process. There are many other archaeologists who have done this sort of work elsewhere in the Southwest. Part of what my dissertation focused on particularly, though, builds on work that I was able to be a part of with an architectural conservator named Angeline Bass, who specializes in earthen plasters. And through working with Angeline, I became aware that these earthen architectural mixes have a lot of variability in them, very similar or kind of akin to ceramics. Archaeologists have a long history of studying ceramics in terms of fabrics or pastes and different recipes and different choices that potters make, everything from the selection of raw materials up through the final firing of a ceramic vessel. And in a lot of ways, these earthen building mixes are very similar. They are used in a whole slew of different construction steps. They are used in mortar. They are used as wall or floor plasters. And they are also used as daub, even in Hakal wall construction. So the images on the right kind of show some of the visible differences in these mortar mixes that are very apparent just at a glance in terms of color and sometimes even in terms of the aggregate or kind of what would be called temper in a ceramic in terms of these sort of larger inclusions that are mixed in. All of these different earthen architectural materials might have different performance characteristics. And so a material or a mix that you would use for a mortar is going to have different requirements than a mix that you might use for a fine finish plaster. You don't want your plasters to be kind of full of gravel-sized particles because you want to have a smooth surface. Likewise, your floor plasters you want to be comfortable to walk on or sit on. Whereas your mortars, you want to make sure that they're not going to be compressed under the weight of the masonry that's stacked upon it. So we can look at some of these variabilities in recipes and also identify or examine commonalities in practice from that perspective. And this is also something that isn't entirely unknown by archaeologists or not, I shouldn't say unknown, but there are archaeologists who have looked at mortars kind of in a larger in situ architectural context, looking at sort of broad differences, particularly in color, to identify some of these different construction groups. So in order to kind of start gathering some of this information, I visited Betatakin and Keet Seel. I did a lot of field documentation and photography, and I am very, very grateful for the help of many friends who were crucial for making sure we could cover as many walls as possible in terms of the photography. We took overall elevation photos, general architectural context photos, kind of like this one, and then also detail photos that were useful later on because I did a lot of the field work kind of in 2021. So access was logistically difficult for a number of reasons, as I'm sure you can all imagine. There was also some difficulty in accessing all of the architectural spaces at these communities. While the Park Service was tremendously helpful in supporting my research and getting me into these spaces, there were also quite a few roofs that at this point are quite old, and the alcoves are continuing to suffer from rockfall occasionally. So when in doubt, I elected not to cross the roofs and not to place any stress on them. So there are spaces I was not able to document. And also because of the kind of time constraints and logistical difficulties with accessing these spaces, many of the observations that I'm going to be talking about in terms of these architectural attributes were kind of derived from photographs combined with in-person notes as I kind of stood there in each of these rooms, frantically recording as much as I could. In addition to all of that sort of chaotic recording, I also identified areas that I thought would be helpful to potentially sample in terms of doing a more detailed analysis of these earthen architectural mixes. And once I had identified those areas for sampling, I conducted micromorphological analyses on samples. I collected a total of 62 samples, 31 from Betatakin and 31 from Keet Seel. This sounds like a lot of samples. Each of the samples was about thumbnail sized, or about 1 to 2 square centimeters in size. Where possible, I did preferentially collect wall fall, as illustrated in kind of the sample documentation sheet on the left side of the screen. Or, for example, on the right side of the screen, that's an image of a multi-layered plaster from the interior of a kiva at Keet Seel, and this fragment had actually already detached from the wall and was lying loose on the kiva bench. And the thin section image directly below that shows the profile view of a sample of the similar sort of plasters, not that exact sample. I picked a smaller one for collecting, but shows the number of layers that are evident in thin section. I said earlier that 62 sounds like kind of a lot of samples, but when you think about the construction of a single room, if you have two different walls that are abutting, they may have different mortars. If you have a Hakal wall versus a masonry wall, you may have two different earthen mixes, one daub and one mortar. If you have any plasters present, that is also a number of different earthen mixes. And then when you start to factor in potential roof plasters from either roof collapse or intact roofs, or floor plasters, you can start to see how even one room might have 5 or more different recipes at play in the space. And so I did try to collect samples from places where I could compare living rooms with living rooms or mortars with mortars. But overall, this was a fairly conservative sampling process. And it was done in full consultation with descendant communities through the Park Service and with their assistance as well. So for the micromorphological analysis, this is somewhat similar to petrographic analysis that is frequently done for ceramics. In this case, I elected to use a scanning electron microscope because the plasters are very thin and I wanted to record as much detail as possible. The micromorphological approach really involves looking at kind of differences in porosity and particle orientation and particle sizes, as well as the relative proportions of the different components of your mixes. For example, the proportion of binder or clay to aggregate or these kind of particles, as well as the pore space, because all of that information can tell you about differences in the degree to which a sample was mixed, or the amount of water that was used. For example, if there are residual clay lumps present, it suggests that the mix is slightly underhydrated, as opposed to a mix with no clay lumps present, which might be a very well-hydrated mix. In addition, with the SEM, you can do some spot mineral identifications and some semi-quantitative analyses of clay types. And I did supplement these semi-quantitative analyses with some X-ray diffraction work as well. But overall, from a compositional perspective, because the people building in the alcoves generally had access to the same geological variability in the surrounding canyons, there wasn't a ton of variability in terms of the base compositions. So really, when looking at these differences in recipe, what I was really looking at were sort of these subtle attributes associated with mixing or adding or removing aggregates, or in some instances, composition changes that are indicated by color differences, as opposed to quantitative mineralogical identifications. So I wanted to evaluate the four models that I talked about earlier, and here I'm going to frame them in terms of some more specific expectations. So under Model 1, the labor group that we might be expecting to see operating in terms of construction is the household or room cluster. And on the right side of the screen, I have some floor plans. These are from Dr. Dean's dissertation that I've colored in with some hypothetical variability or similarities, actually, in terms of architecture. So the colors that are the same kind of represent spaces where the choices the builders are making are very similar. These particular maps have the room clusters highlighted in bold and kind of called out with labels. And in this particular case, the variability within room clusters should be low compared to the variability between room clusters. Or in other words, the people who are building spaces seem to be building room cluster by room cluster. Model 2 suggests that there is some sort of supra-household group or combination of room clusters that are working together to build. At Betatakin, this might be the courtyard complexes, where you have kind of built-in neighborhoods, so to speak, who are working together to build. It could also be spatially discrete households. Maybe at Keet Seel, people were related but weren't able to build right next to each other, but they still helped each other with the building process. These supra-household groups might be extended kin. They might just be your nearest neighbor by convenience. They could be some other form of larger social unit that a household or members of a household were part of who could be called upon to help with these kind of intensive labor tasks. Model 3 is kind of an alternative hypothesis. As I was thinking about models 1 and 2, I thought to myself, what if there is absolutely no pattern in the variability? What if it's essentially random? And what would that mean? And one possibility is that if there is no spatial patterning to the variability in these architectural attributes, then it might be the case that everybody helped out every time they could. And so you see just this mishmash of almost the too many cooks in the kitchen kind of scenario where everybody is helping in every way that they can. A possible alternative explanation to this is that the variables that I recorded, or the level of detail at which I recorded those variables, wasn't sufficient to pick up on patterning in variability. So it's kind of a data quality control model as well. And then model 4 is the kind of case of the Kayenta construction crew. This would be the case where rather than random variability, there's just no variability. Everything is very consistent. It's like a suburb almost. Cookie cutter kind of houses that are being built with very, very similar or identical choices being made throughout the entire construction process. And this might suggest that you have one group of builders responsible for all construction. Much like Model 3, though, there is the possibility that this is kind of more of a quality control on the data, and that rather than there being a total lack of variability or complete homogeneity in choices, instead the attributes that I've recorded or the detail that I've recorded them in might not be sufficient to pick up on patterns in variability. So another kind of quality control hypothesis. So in order to evaluate these models, I wanted to answer these three questions. The first question, is there any variability in attributes? That kind of evaluates whether we're talking about models 1, 2, and 3 or model 4. If there is variability, is that variability spatially patterned? That kind of differentiates models 1 and 2 from model 3. And then if that variability is spatially patterned, is that patterning associated with households or room clusters? Or is it associated with these sort of supra-household groups, maybe courtyard complexes or multiple room clusters kind of together? So this is where I kind of get into showing more pictures of the architecture in detail. There's a lot happening on this slide. I'm not expecting you guys to read it all. It's kind of here just as a visual while I'm talking through. I did my best to make as many primary observations as possible, but as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't able to access every space. There were also some spaces that had been significantly altered since previous observers were there. For example, there were at least a couple of rooms that when Dr. Dean did his work in the 1960s had intact roofs. And by the time I came to do my work in the 2020s, the roofs had collapsed due to rockfall. So I was unable to evaluate the interiors or floors of those rooms. So in many cases, I relied on a combination of my observations paired with the observations made by previous researchers, and particularly Dr. Dean, but also supplemented by observations associated with various Park Service stabilization or condition assessment efforts. Oftentimes those were accompanied by photographs and even an examination of historic photos. There are images from 1909 at Betatakin when Byron Cummings visited the site, and also at Keet Seel, actually, from 1909 as well. And so through a combination of information from various sources, these were some of the attributes that I tried to document as thoroughly as possible. So I'm going to try to not take too long on these slides. I can go off in the details about these different aspects of construction. Kind of keeping an eye on time here, though. So I wanted to just showcase some of the variability that is present. These are some examples of different floors at both Betatakin and Keet Seel. For the purposes of these illustrations, I have combined examples from the two communities. Overall, you can see that floors range from unmodified bedrock, kind of in that upper right corner, to carefully laid and fitted flagstone, as in the upper or the lower left corner. You also have combinations of modified bedrock and plaster, or even the roofs of lower story rooms. Some of this variation is functional. If you have a granary, for instance, you're trying to keep pests out, so you want a very robust floor. You may be building directly on bedrock so that rodents don't have a chance to kind of come up through room fill and get into your food stores. Alternatively, if you are building on a steeply sloped bedrock face, you may have to do some combination of fill with plaster over it, because building and using just the plain alcove floor as your floor space would leave you with a very undesirable kind of angle to the interior of your room. Jumping ahead a little bit to walls, there's also a tremendous amount of variability in walls. The image on the left is kind of a compilation, almost like a glossary of different examples of walls at Betatakin and Keet Seel. The image on the right is a modified version of one of Dr. Dean's figures. Dean and Alexander Lindsay both kind of defined these masonry types for Kayenta construction, and they are very present and visible at Betatakin and Keet Seel. The Looking at the figure on the right, on the top row, there are two examples of sort of a typical Kayenta masonry, which is kind of roughly coursed to uncoursed with a ton of mortar. The image in A is actually of a wall at Betatakin, and the image in B is my trace of many of the masonry units in that wall. On the bottom row of that figure, there are examples of kind of respectively going from C to E, tabular masonry. You can see an example of that over on the left in F. There's also image D on the right, massive masonry or kind of more blocky masonry. And image E on the right shows a drawing of Cyclopean masonry, which is really illustrated well in images G and H on the left side of the screen. And this is just variability in masonry. In addition to this kind of wall variability, there is also variability in terms of whether a wall is Hakal or masonry, or even whether it is masonry from the base courses up to the top, or if it's masonry partially constructed over a part of the alcove or a boulder. For example, in image H, you can see actually part of a boulder that has been included in that wall. So just a tremendous amount of variability in masonry construction. And also, if you turn your attention to image I on the left side of the screen, this is a granary that Dr. Dean actually identified as having a Mesa Verde style masonry. So this is at Keet Seel, and there's just a tremendous amount of variability in masonry at Keet Seel. Wall entries, which is a term kind of used after Larry Nordby, who is an archaeologist who worked at Mesa Verde for a very long time and has a lot of familiarity with alcove sites. These exhibit a tremendous amount of variability as well. The image on the right is an example from Betatakin, and it kind of has different components of wall entries labeled. The image on the left showcases some of the diversity in wall entries present at the two communities. As with floors and also with walls, some of this variability is functional. There's a little bit of potential for circular logic in some of what I'm talking about because I'm looking at differences in architectural attributes, but some of those differences in attributes are functional based on room types, and I'm using those room types to help me look at differences in attributes. So there's a little bit of circularity here, but for example, if you have a granary, you want to be able to close your wall entry so nothing can get in or out that you don't want getting in or out. So a lot of these images on the left that have raised sills are actually of granaries, as compared to the images where the sills sit at or below grade. Those are of living rooms. So again, some of these attribute variations are functional, and some of these attribute variations likely reflect different choices. You can also see, even in the raised sill examples, there's a tremendous amount of variability. Take, for example, image J on the left versus image C on the left. Those are both granary entryways, and they have very different sill stones, as well as different lintel types. So just again, a tremendous amount of variability present and observable. Roofs are another area that showcases a lot of diversity and variability. I'm not a dendrochronologist, so with roofs particularly, I pulled quite heavily on the observations of previous researchers. But even as a relative layperson, looking just at these images, you can see that there are differences in the closing materials used, differences in the species, orientation, size, debarking or lack thereof, and end treatment of primary beams, as well as for secondary beams, whether secondary beams are even present or not, and whether beams are placed singly or in pairs. And on the right side of the screen, there are examples of different ties that are used to secure closing materials to the roof beams. So again, tremendous variability in architectural practice. And this is given that in general, your functional constraints on roof construction is that you want to make sure they don't collapse on you. But even working within that kind of functional constraint and that need, there's still a lot of variability that builders have manifested in their work, so to speak. This is another slide I'm going to kind of skip through because I, as I anticipated, talked a bit too long about all of those photos. But these are some of the variables that I looked at specifically with regards to the earthen materials when I was standing in situ in these rooms, identifying these different mixes on these walls. and on these floors and so on. Just to go really quickly through some examples of the variability in these earthen mixes. In terms of floor plasters, there's variability in the substrate. Maybe these plasters are placed directly over bedrock, maybe they're over fill. In terms of the color of the mix, in terms of the composition, whether it's aggregate that has been admixed or removed, and even whether the mix is kind of a cleaner sediment that has been prepared and applied, or it's a mix that incorporates a lot of charcoal and ash, which might also confer kind of a waterproofing element to the mix. Mortars also exhibit quite a bit of variability, and I will say that with all of these attributes, and I forgot to say this earlier, you do have to be careful that you aren't misidentifying variability that results from stabilization or like Park Service conservation efforts as variability associated with original builders. So with that being said, there's still a lot of variability that you can kind of pick up on in these mixes, ranging from, for example, in the top image, image A, that is a sherd that was used as a chinking material in a wall. And in image B, there's actually a corn cob that was used as a chinking material in the wall. As with floors, these mortar mixes and plasters or wall plasters kind of applied to make a wall smooth and level, they can have variability in color and in aggregate and other kind of admixture characteristics that you can see in person standing there. In terms of finer wall plasters and washes, it's actually a bit more difficult to document variability and attributes in person because they are so fine and so thinly applied. Oftentimes, you can get a sense for stratigraphy, as illustrated by the images in the upper right part of the slide here. But for the most part, beyond kind of getting a sense for the number of layers and broad color descriptions, and maybe the thickness of layers, you're not going to be able to see much in terms of aggregate in these mixes because they are designed and engineered to be very fine-grained. Okay, so I'm running out of time. I'm going to jump through these next bits quickly. So evaluating these three questions, is there variability in attributes? I hope that the previous slides have indicated, yes, there is a lot of variability in attributes. Is that variability spatially patterned? That has to be determined. Is that spatial patterning, if it is present, associated with household or suprahouseholds? So how do I take all of those attributes, various information from the architecture, and determine if it's spatially patterned? For that, I used something called a Jacquard similarity index, which essentially takes two sets of observations and looks at the similarities and differences between those sets and comes up with a similarity index or value. A high value, indicated in green, kind of in this example, is 100% similarity, and a low value, indicated in white, is a very high dissimilarity. There's not a lot of commonality in the two sets of observations. This example is from Betatakin, and it shows rooms organized by room cluster, essentially. And you can see that within room clusters, the similarities tend to be high. There are no low similarity scores within the room cluster bounds. There are some higher similarity or moderate similarity scores between room clusters, but overall, similarity within room clusters is pretty high. So another slide that has a lot of information on it, and I know it's very small. This is really in here just to show that I looked at these values for all of the attributes I recorded. I looked at the overall range of similarity scores within room clusters and between room clusters and kind of came up with an overall evaluation for whether this patterning seemed to be associated with room clusters or groups of room clusters or not patterned. And overall, most of the attributes that I accumulated information on do support Model 1. That is, generally the variability is high within room clusters, and this suggests that individual households are doing their own building. A couple of the attributes and a couple of the architectural elements do seem to support Model 3. In this specific case of all of these attributes shown here on this table, I actually think that Model 3 is more of a data quality issue because the sample sizes for those observations was very small. But that needs some refining to see if they really might shake out into a different model or if they actually do support Model 3. In which case, there could be some interesting implications for different labor organizations kind of doing different parts of the building. So I'm a bit over time. I'm just going to conclude by saying the results of this work, which support Model 1, also line up very well with Dr. Dean's work over 30 years ago. Actually, at this point, over, gosh, 70 years ago almost. Um, and I don't know if I did my math right there, but the point is, Dr. Dean was spot on. Not surprising. My results very much built off of his work, and it's very gratifying that they support his conclusions regarding these room clusters kind of being discrete units that are constructed all at one time. And now we can take that a bit further by saying they were built by the people using those spaces, or at least different builders were responsible for each room cluster. Um, I'll kind of just wrap it up by saying that in terms of future directions, I want to go back and kind of revisit some of those attributes that seem to fall under Model 3 and potentially revisit the images to expand on or clarify some of the observations that were collated from various data sources, and maybe even revisit the communities. So with that, I'm going to stop my uh, chaotic crash through the last few slides. And let me see here. I'm going to leave my slides up in case anyone wants to go back to anything, but let me get the Q&A open here. Um, all right. So we have one question which says, how was Dr. Dean able to determine the stockpiling of materials? Presumably all of the dendro data comes back with similar dates if the materials were stockpiled. How could you tell that the construction took place later? This is a very good question, and it's been a while since I've reviewed that specific detail, so I hope I don't butcher the answer here. Um, Essentially, the stockpiling was determined because there were a whole series of beams that had very similar dates. Um, and when those beams were used in later construction, based on the surrounding architecture and based on the pattern of bond abutment, as well as dates that weren't from stockpiled beams, um, Dr. Dean was able to determine that the kind of later dates, for example, the beams might have been stockpiled in 1267. These beams were used in rooms that also had building dates or dates associated with roof construction that might have been, say, in the early 1270s, for example. And so basically, it's a combination of dates. And I'm afraid I'm not doing it justice. I do highly recommend. It's an excellent read if you haven't read Dr. Dean's the publication from either the University of Arizona Press Laboratory Tree Ring papers or his actual dissertation. He does a much better job of explaining that than I just did. Um, so we have a couple more questions, or one more question, it looks like. How similar were the plasters or construction techniques of Hakal walls within or between either site? That is an excellent question. Because I took so few samples, I wasn't able to. This is one of the sampling issues with kind of the Hakal daubs falling under Model 3. Um, I wasn't able to really get a sense for any sort of patterning in the variability of those recipes. As far as the actual Hakal construction, this is something I would like to revisit. In many cases, and kind of unsurprisingly, the Hakal construction tends to weather at a different rate than the masonry walls. And so when you're looking at these Hakal walls, you have to be very cognizant of what is stabilization and what is kind of an original fabric or the choice of an original builder, an ancestral builder, because oftentimes stabilization efforts kind of target the Hakal daubs and focus on resetting posts and even reapplying daub over the bases of walls. So this is a question that, at first glance, in terms of Hakal construction, as somebody who hasn't built with Hakal myself, there's not a ton of difference that immediately jumps out at me, at least in terms of it's nothing comparable to the masonry construction, I'll say. Um, Let me see here. Getting questions coming up in two different boxes, so I hope you'll kind of bear with me as I pull up these boxes. Um, okay, so we have a question that says, as the story goes, the migration to this area was largely motivated by defensive needs. Certainly, Keet Seel shows this. Are there indications of rushed work, or did the work seem carefully planned and executed? Um, Dr. Dean discusses the sort of defensive aspect of these two communities, and he kind of sums up, I think, very well in that there was a lot of defensive potential at these alcove sites. I mean, certainly they are up above kind of the level of the canyon. And generally, especially even today, if you go and visit Keet Seel, there's a large ladder you have to climb up to access the community. So it would have been defensible. Um, in terms of indications of rushed work or work being planned very kind of carefully, I would say at Keet Seel, in terms of rushed work, it's less that the work in either community was rushed and more that in general a lot of the construction for these individual room clusters could have been fairly easily accomplished and comfortably accomplished by a relatively small group of, say, about 5 people, let's say per room cluster over the course of a year. And so most of the construction, and this is borne out in Dr. Dean's dendrochronological work for these individual room clusters, did take place over about the span of a year. This wouldn't necessarily be rushed. But again, at Betatakin, there is more evidence of kind of a planned movement from a single origin, whereas at Keet Seel, there's more evidence for people coming in from all over the place. That could suggest that there was some impetus for people to move into these alcove spaces, but I can't really speak more to defensive needs per se. There's another question that asks, in terms of stockpiling, were primary or secondary beams stockpiled? Primary beams were almost certainly stockpiled. If I'm remembering correctly, secondary beams, I think it was a little bit less clear. Oftentimes, and if someone is a dendrochronologist and wants to correct me on this, please feel free. Many of the tree species that are used for secondary beams tend to be a little bit more difficult to date in this particular location. And so I think, and I'd have to review the details on this, but again, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Dean's publication because he's the dendro guy. But I believe that the secondary beams, it wasn't as clear whether they were stockpiled or not. Okay, another question that says, were you able to distinguish how many family groups came together at those sites? Kind of. Dr. Dean actually did a population estimate for the two communities based on the number of living rooms or what he defined as living rooms, according to the different architectural features that were present in the spaces. And I want to say that at Betatakin it was between 80 and 100 people, and at Keet Seel it was a few more, maybe 120. As I kind of flew through earlier, at Betatakin there are at least 18 of these room clusters. So if we take room clusters to be households, there were probably at least 18 households. There are also, though, those courtyard complexes, so it could be that there were, 14 family groups living there, with 4 of those family groups kind of sharing an extended courtyard complex space, or there could have been 18 family groups present with 18 different household spaces. At Keet Seel, there were at least 25 of these room clusters. Again, that's as defined by Dr. Dean. And he goes into more detail about this, but he suspects that for much of the Kayenta region, these sort of room cluster units represented extended family groups, although it is possible that in certain cases the households themselves were actually lived in by nuclear family units. Let's see. Make sure I'm not missing any questions. There's a question that asks, would Inscription House have similar construction methods as Betatakin and Keet Seel? I believe it would. Generally speaking, these are all built kind of using Kayenta construction practices, with the exception of like the random occasional Mesa Verde masonry one-off, as illustrated at Keet Seel. Um, I actually originally had hoped to include Inscription House as well in my dissertation, but Inscription House is kind of even more difficult to access than Betatakin and Keet Seel. The arroyo that under basically the arroyo next to the Inscription House alcove has been massively entrenched. And so you now need technical climbing gear to get into Inscription House. With that being said, I did read a plaster condition assessment report from Inscription House, and overall, the plasters there do sound similar as described to those that I saw at Betatakin and Keet Seel. And in general, the architectural forms would be very similar. Dr. Dean was able to include, I believe, Inscription House in his dissertation, and describes kind of similar social units present at that community as well, and other communities throughout Tsegi Canyon. There's a question here that says it must have been difficult to get beams up the ladders to Keet Seel. Has anyone pondered the method? Um, that is an excellent question. There are So yes and no. At Keet Seel specifically, there is a very large beam that runs across the front of the site. Let's see if I can kind of navigate back to a view that shows it here. Um, you can kind of see it in this image. If you can see my mouse here, there's just a massive tree that spans the front of the site. And there have been numerous interpretations or explanations for this tree and what it means and how it got there. It doesn't date, unfortunately, if I recall correctly, but there are actually rope marks on this tree. In the 1930s, there was a Civil Works Administration project that worked at Keet Seel. They excavated many of the rooms at Keet Seel, as well as part of the talus slope below the alcove. And they also reconstructed significant portions of the retaining wall across the front of the site. And there are indications in their notes that they used a sort of rope and pulley system over this beam to help haul mortar up into the site. It doesn't really answer the question about trees per se. There is an archaeologist who worked in the Sierra Anchas in Arizona. As I'm sure you all are more familiar with that mountain range than I am, being in Arizona, but he reported that it took 3 to 4 people to get a single primary beam into an alcove for a stabilization effort at one of the alcove sites in the Sierra Anchas. So certainly a labor-intensive and time-consuming endeavor. Another question, did you consult with anyone with building experience about how well their materials, such as mortar, functioned? No, I did not, and that is part of the potential future directions for research that I totally forgot to talk about. These traditional building materials and traditional building practices are an incredible way to use sustainable building materials. And the engineering skill that went into these mixes and that went into these constructions, as attested to by the fact that they're still standing after all this time, can teach us a lot about how to build better, I guess, so to speak. And one aspect of this work that I would be interested in pursuing further would be working with descendant communities, and working with builders at descendant communities, and particularly those communities where people are still building using earth as sort of a primary building material, to talk about different recipes and to think about how these different mixes might have had modifications based on different performance characteristics or needs based on where they were being used in buildings. In general, from a sort of material science perspective, there are certain things that you want to make sure of, like you don't want to use a smectite rich clay mix as your mortar, because if that once that is drying out, it's gonna shrink considerably. A lot of the technical choices that people have to be aware of in building with earth are very similar to a lot of the choices people have to be aware of when working with clays for ceramic production. So there's a lot of sort of technological overlap in terms of know-how, and just knowledge in general. But sort of similar to ceramics, You want to make sure that you're not introducing a ton of salts into your mixes because salts can be very, very harmful. You want to make sure that your clays aren't too prone to shrinking or swelling. You want to make sure that if you use any sort of vegetal material, that it is chopped kind of roughly and coarsely so that it has sort of a tensile strength conferring effect, as opposed to really just being in there to decay and cause voids that might lead to eventual collapse of your mix. There are many archaeologists working in Egypt and Cyprus and other parts of the world who have examined sort of building with earth kind of from a more technological perspective. And so I did kind of rely on a lot of their information as well in thinking about some of these different mixes. Let's see. Make sure.
I think we have one question left that's been posted so far. That's over in the webinar chat. It's a follow-up to the stockpiling question. It says primary beams have to cure for at least a year while secondary beams may be used immediately. So how may this affect stockpiling?
Yes, that is an excellent follow-up. Um, Part of this plays into thinking about the timing of construction a little bit. So there is an archaeologist, Michael Graves, who's done some work at Canyon Creek Cliff Dwelling or Alcove, and he in his work there, he actually suggested that primary beams were used, or sorry, secondary beams were used to build sort of temporary shelters while construction of the main houses were going on. And while primary beams were kind of curing or drying out, so to speak. With that being said, in terms of stockpiling or not, that is something to kind of look into further. There are a lot of benefits to stockpiling that, especially in terms of primary beams, have a direct impact on the ability to use those materials for construction. For example, a beam that hasn't been dried out is going to weigh a lot more than a beam that has had time to cure. A beam that has had time to cure is also going to have a stronger strength in terms of being able to support weight. Um, Secondary beams, this may not be quite as crucial because they are, as the name implies, secondary in terms of roof support, but it's definitely something that bears further investigation. The I don't want to pick on him too much, but Dr. Reynolds, who asked this question, his dissertation I also pulled on to do my work, and in his dissertation he worked with builders from Taos and talked with them about their construction processes. And so at Taos, the secondary beams, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Reynolds, but the beams were used without curing, or just immediately employed. And this makes a lot of sense because in terms of these architectural materials as well, they might have different uses. So maybe you have just a set of materials that you can use either for building or for something else like preparing a field or making a fire. So there's a lot more to think about with building. It's very, very complex, but let's see. I believe, unless I've missed any questions, I
No,
think that's
I think you got them all, Katie. So unless there's anything else, okay, it's correct. Secondary beams do not have to cure. So that was from Dr. Reynolds, his confirmation of that. Um, well, thank you so much, Katie. It was an excellent talk. I enjoyed it very much, and thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everybody that joined us this evening. And unless there's anything else, I guess I will bid you all adieu and hope you all have a good holiday season coming up.
yes. Thank you all so much for listening to my rambling. I kind of lost track of what I was saying towards the end.
Okay, well, thank you all. So.